her two objectives for this speech, which is going to be 6 to 8 minutes long, is the first is learn the elements of a good story, and then create a story and tell an original story based on personal experience. And so DT, the key element of the title, is Barbara's mother. And she's known as DT to her friends, and apparently was quite a remarkable woman. And mother was an emergency room nurse, right there, so wow. And a surgical nurse. And of course, knowing that you have a nurse in the neighborhood, everybody in the neighborhood, mothers, would come to the door. So neighborhood moms would bring their banged up kids to Barbara's house for her to get fixed up. So Barbara's story is about the role of her mother and the family medicine cabinet played in the daily lives of these neighbors on the stretch of Highway 40 in Indiana. And Highway 40 comes all the way across the United States, coast to coast. So, which at the time was the main highway crossing the entire United States. And so please join with me and Barbara on the story of DT and the neighborhood emergency room.
We had a woods and a creek behind our house. And it was a wonderful place to play. All the neighborhood kids would play in the woods. And it was great. It had poison ivy and poison oak, copperheads, water moccasins, ticks, fleas, chiggers, and millions of mosquitoes. It was great. There was also a lumber yard that was just up the road, and that afforded wonderful places to get hurt as well. So when kids got hurt, they would come to my mother's house. The reason why they came to my mother's house was because of our medicine cabinet. Our medicine cabinet groaned under the weight of the medicines that were in there. I thought everybody had a medicine cabinet like that when I was a kid, but later I found out that ours was different. My mother worked at the hospital, and during this time period, it was the procedure when somebody died to take all of their bandages and everything that was in the cabinet next to them and all the medicines and throw it away. And my mother was a child of the Depression. And she just could not cope with that, so she brought it all home. So we had in this medicine cabinet everything imaginable. We had every kind of bandage that there was. We had those big butterfly ones that you put instead of sutures on wounds. There was nothing that she didn't have. And we always had at least a gallon of a liquid that was bright orange. Some of you may remember it was called methylate or mercurochrome. And she would, after she'd clean everybody up, she'd slather on that mercurochrome, and it burned like crazy. It was just awful. And I was thinking about that the other day, and I looked it up in the dictionary to see what was in it. It was two main ingredients. One of them is bromine, which is a toxic substance, and the other one was mercury. Well, no wonder it burned. Probably the surprising thing is that we survived with that kind of treatment, but she could fix sprains, wounds, sutures, whatever it was. She could put it together. But there were two incidents that occurred when I was a kid that stand out in my mind. The first one, I was about 10. And a man came to our house, drove in the driveway, in a beat-up, old, dusty car. And he got out of the car, and he was a beat-up, dusty man. He didn't smell good, and his teeth were all rotten. And he came over, and he said, "Miss Tony, I need your help." Now, she had no idea who he was, but everybody knew my mother. And he said, "Miss Tony, I need your help. My wife is passed out, and I can't wake her up." And she was very reluctant to go with this man that she didn't know, and he was so sleazy looking. So she made me go with her for protection. So we got to the abandoned motel where they were living. They were living in the manager's apartment. And we walked in, and I was literally enveloped in a smell that I never knew existed on the planet. There was garbage everywhere, food, everything all around. His smell was a combination of dirty bodies, dirty clothes, beer cans that was stale beer, whiskey that had spilled, vomit, and urine. We walked into the bedroom, and there was this woman lying on just a bare mattress on the floor. She was kind of turned on her side. She was breathing very heavily, and she had spittle kind of bubbling out of the side of her mouth. There was vomit next to her. She had urinated on herself, and so the whole bottom half of her dress was just soaked with urine. And on her back, on her bottom, you could see that there was feces that was stuck to it. My mother said, "How long has this woman been like this?" And the man said, "Well, it's kind of hard to tell. See, we was a-drinking, and she just stopped talking. I don't know what was the matter. I couldn't wake her up. I couldn't do anything. So I got worried, and I thought maybe I'd better come get you. It's been, maybe 2-3 days. 2 or 3 days, my mother was livid. How could you? What is wrong with you? 2 or 3 days, this woman has severe alcohol poisoning, and she is going to die if we don't get her to the hospital immediately." So she called the ambulance. They came. They took her away. Put her on the ambulance, that feces and urine body, oh gosh, just put her right in. We never found out whether she lived or not, but if she did live, it was only because of my mother and her intervention with this. The other story happened about a year later, and we were in the kitchen, and we faced Highway 40, which was a very, very busy road, and we heard this horrific sound, squealing tires and collisions and all kinds of things. We ran out the front door, and about 200 yards up there was a Stuckey's. Stuckey's is a store. And we ran across and went up there, and there were 2 overturned motorcycles. And one of them was a man who was just covered with blood, but he was conscious. And the other one was a man who was just lying out flat on the ground. And he was in a pool of blood. And even I could tell that this man was seriously injured. My mother, very calm, just asked the other man what this gentleman's name was. And then she got down on her knees in that parking lot, in that pool of blood. And she took his hand and she said, "John, you have to breathe. Breathe, John. Listen to me. Stay with me, John. You have to breathe." And she did that for over 20 minutes, waiting for the ambulance to come. And when the ambulance came, he was so injured that they immediately took him to Indianapolis, where the specialty hospitals were. Because he was in Indianapolis, we had no idea what had happened to him, whether he had actually survived or not. And about 6 months later, my mother received a card in the mail. "I am John, the man who was in the motorcycle accident. I don't remember the accident, but I do remember you. You kept hounding me to breathe. All I wanted to do was sleep, but you wouldn't let me. If it hadn't been for you talking to me, I know I wouldn't have lasted until the ambulance arrived. Thank you for saving my life." My mother was a nurse during the day, and she was a nurse during the night. She left a legacy behind of dozens and dozens of adults who now remember being kids and getting fixed up at DT's emergency room. And somewhere there's a man who owes his life to her caring and concern. She was a special lady.